From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible for Change. This is an exciting episode we're going to have about workers' rights in Montana. You know, labor and organized workers and organized labor in the form of unions have played a very important and instrumental role in Montana's politics and history since the beginning of Montana, starting with what was happening in the other crucible, the crucible of unionism in Butte, with the Anaconda Company and the big mining companies, and labor continued to be an extraordinarily important force in politics and government in Montana. And in the crucible of change, there were a lot of great things happen that helped improve workers' rights as Montana shed the copper collar. And we're calling this session Leveling the Playing Field. And it's about how did actual workers and labor rights advance during the 1970s legislature. We have a couple special guests with us today. First, I want to mention John Board. John is on with us for his first time. We're so happy to have you here, John. John was 20 years in the classroom before he became the head of the Montana Education Association. He was the head in 1973 of the Great Falls Education Association, and then starting in 1976 became the MEA president, and by 1978 it was a full-time position. So he was one of the top labor leaders in terms of teachers in this state for almost a decade during this period of change. Later, after 1984, when he left the MEA, he left the state for a prolonged period. He worked for the Connecticut MEA, or the Connecticut Education Association, eventually coming back to Montana, where he's done a number of things. He's been pretty much retired for the last 20 years, but he's become a deacon in the Episcopal Church. He's become the person who makes sense, organizational sense, out of the Archie Bray Ceramics Foundation. And he's been a superior player in Montana politics and Montana government, and a true progressive, which makes him fit with this series quite well. So welcome, John.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you here. And Jim Murry, we're very familiar with Jim. He's been on camera with us a few times, and Jim is the 26 years the head of the AFL-CIO in Montana, one of the top labor leaders in the nation, recognized as one of the most powerful people in Montana during this period by unbiased sources, meaning the newspapers. And so Jim has been with us before. And it's appropriate that during this entire time he was heading the AFL-CIO, the top labor organization in the state, heading the lobbying efforts and the efforts with the legislature through this period. So it's appropriate that you're here to kind of help fill in the gaps to see how we did for workers in the 1970s. So welcome on board.
Thank you, Evan. It's great to be here, and it's great to be here with my old friend John Board, because we worked together during much of this period that we're talking about here today. As we talk about that particular period, one of the things that I think can't go unnoticed Montana was always one of the most highly unionized states in America. We were, when we slipped down to 10th, we were kind of disappointed to have slid that far. But in 1953, which was, by the way, John, that was the year I graduated from high school. Can you imagine that? We were the second or third most highly unionized state in America, and that was part of our culture. That was a very important part of the political culture in Montana that allowed us to bring about so many of these changes that were so important to workers, both workers that were union members and those that were not. Because as we lobbied for things like workers' compensation benefits and unemployment compensation benefits and minimum wage protection and those kind of things, we didn't go to the legislature and say, we just want these protections for union members. Those protections were for every worker. Mm-hmm. And so the impact, the impact that was so noticeable during this period, the impact of the labor movement, came primarily because of the culture that we had for so many years in Montana of being one of the most highly unionized states in America.
Well, you know, labor, it seems, played a big role in a lot of the big political issues. We're going to focus on some of the specific worker-oriented things, but leading up to this period, organized labor was, and we talked about this in a previous segment, by the way.
Yes.
But for example, the role with the sales tax. I mean, organized labor was the AFL-CIO and played a gigantic role in the 1971 sales tax thing, as well as all the way back to '67 and earlier.
Yes, and as we talk about that, one of the things that I think is so important, and John, I would think you'd probably agree with this, the labor movement in organizations like the Education Association had a lot of influence in the legislature. That came not just because of our organizations, it came because of the coalitions that we worked with. And for example, the Foundation for the Progressive Political Movement in Montana was the old Farm Labor Coalition that went clear back to shortly after the first Constitutional Convention, when the realization was that workers and family farmers and ranchers weren't treated very well in that convention, and so it brought progressive political thinkers from the agriculture community together with workers, and that was really the first coalition. But then, as the years went by, that coalition was expanded to include organizations from the environmental movement, women's organizations,
low-income organizations,
low-income groups. That's right. Mainline churches were a very important part.
We have a section that talks about that.
And that's right. But it's good to remember. I think it's really good to remember the role that coalition played in bringing about all of these changes. And it didn't come. It didn't come just because of the labor movement.
Just by itself.
Labor leader.
Sure.
No.
But I think what you kind of glossed over is the education, or the teachers for sure, really didn't started getting involved until maybe 1973. So we tagged along. You will remember, Jim, that when you first met me in 1980, I called you up to try to get an organization going in demonstration to demonstrate against Ronald Reagan becoming president. And you were really skeptical of who this guy was, because I was from MEA, and the MEA's reputation was that it was a company
union, so not even a union, but a company group.
Not even a union at that time, no. But so we tagged along, but we caught up.
Well, you know, and of course, I had that same experience in a much lesser degree. The one year I was teaching, I discovered how the Education Association It wasn't even collective bargaining. It was just like we don't want to really do this. We're not very professional.
Well, teachers were treated more like tall children by the school boards and certainly by the administration. I can remember in 1973, I attended my first NEA convention in Portland, Oregon. And I remember sitting by a principal from Great Falls. And at that convention, the NEA kicked out administrators. And this principal said to me at some point, he said, well, I think teachers now are able to carry on this work. And I thought, well, I won't repeat what I thought, but that
maybe you grew up, you're no longer a teenager.
All of a sudden we, even though we had been college educated and that, all of a sudden we could take control of our organization.
Well, it was a transition that you played a big part in.
You betcha, and a lot of other teachers too.
And in this period, Jim, in addition, I mentioned the sales tax, and the sales tax in conjunction, because of that activity in '71, the influence labor had on who was at the Constitutional Convention. Wasn't the majority of all those delegates endorsed by labor?
We're labor endorsed delegates, and then of course we played a very important role. And I'm not just talking about myself or the Montana State AFL-CIO. The labor movement in general played a very important role in that Constitutional Convention. Communicating with the delegates from from the different areas around the state, and appearing at hearings and lobbying, and
we got a pretty good product out of that.
We got a very good product, and there were, at that time, there were a lot of people that were about as skeptical about a Constitutional Convention as I was of John when he came into my office, when he described that a little while ago. John came in looking like he is here today with wearing a tie and looking really pretty sharp. And I'm a guy from the south side of Laurel that worked in a refinery. And so as I was looking at John, I thought, is this guy real? Well, it turned out that he was real. He was real.
But I want to tell you, I remember at the MEA convention rising and introducing a motion that the MEA try to get teachers elected to the Constitutional Convention. Well, it passed. But it passed after a lot of discussion because there were many teachers who felt this was not the role of a teacher.
Don't get your hands dirty.
And I think we had two members.
Bob Woodmansey
from Great Falls and Noel Furlong from Kalispell.
Yeah.
But that was a breakthrough.
Yeah,
to do that.
We talk about the breakthrough of the number of women there, but you're saying it was a breakthrough to have some teachers there. Now,
well,
there were some MFT teachers there too.
Oh, really?
Well, Dan Harrington is an example.
Okay.
But it probably was a bit of a breakthrough because it wasn't easy for teachers to get the time to do it, even in some cases.
No.
And in the '71 session, leading into this period we're talking about, while the big battle was the sales tax, didn't you guys finally, after a lot of time, pull off something on the minimum wage?
Well, that was when we enacted the first minimum wage law in Montana, and that was really a big deal, because not only did we finally, and this was after a struggle of many years, the minimum wage was introduced in several sessions, always to be defeated. We passed it, and it wasn't just a minimum wage law; it was one of the best in the nation. It was really a great piece of legislation.
And if we look forward, we spring forward into the mid '70s, I think at least twice during the '70s that was upgraded and even made a little better,
that's right,
and renewed,
that's right.
and so on.
Well, I think that I can remember. Maybe it was a '73 session. I think we went to $2 an hour. The conservatives were just screaming to high heaven that it was going to put kids out of work, and it was going to have there'd be such dire consequences for the passage of that law. What did
Yeah, that was 1975. It went from $1.60 to $1.80, and then to $2. And yeah, it was like, this is going to cost jobs. You know,
That's
we
right.
still hear that stuff today.
Oh,
by the way.
always.
We still hear that today, that it's a job crusher, and it never really proves out to be.
That's right.
Now, by the way, it's worth noting that that stuff that you started, and it was always an effort, as it is nationally on minimum wage, and as it is in other states often on minimum wage, is you get to set it, and then you wait 10 years to move it up a notch. And in Montana, we solved that about 6-7 years ago, and in fact, it was Governor Bullock led the charge then as a private attorney, as I recall.
That's right.
To pass a minimum wage initiative that not only established it and notched it up, but indexed it. So every year it gets adjusted in terms of its value. So we have probably, maybe right now, the best minimum wage law in the nation.
Well, it's $8.05, isn't it? About
Something like that.
It's still too low.
Well, of course it is.
You know, it's still too low, but but Montana has been in the forefront, and it's been a little tougher to get those increases.
Now we're locked into them, but of course everyone's kind of looking at what's happening nationally.
Yeah, that's right. That's
But
right.
it is interesting that that it was a long fight to get it. It was in the 70s, starting in 71, when you really got it
Yes.
taken care of
Yeah,
the first time.
Yes, but it'd been introduced for years,
Yeah.
and we could never get it through. But you know, there was landmark legislation during that period, collective bargaining for public employees, and John can speak to what that meant to teachers, because later the teachers were brought under the Collective Bargaining Act that gave them
Public employees.
or public employees, excuse me, the Collective Bargaining Act for public employees, which gave teachers, for example, the right to strike.
Yeah. Let me set the little tone for exactly how this proceeded, because I think it's important to note that we had the big Donnybrook in 71, and it was over the sales tax predominantly. They were implementing executive reorganization. They were very unhappy about having to do that, but Forrest had gotten a constitutional amendment. It made him do it. You had the sales tax in there, or the minimum wage, but the sales tax took it 120 days. In fact, let's stop for a second, because 120 days of fighting over the sales tax in the 71 legislature. Tell us what you did in Great Falls, because you'd run for the legislature unsuccessfully.
Oh, well, let's forget about it.
No, John, that's a great story.
That's a great story.
That's a great story.
In what way? I ran in 68 and 70 and almost made it in 68. I was the next one to the last. 70 I didn't. But what I found, I ran as a Republican. And I discovered in the process of running.
Maybe that was the reason I was kind of skeptical when you came in to see me that time.
Well, but as I campaigned door to door, at that time not many people went door to door.
Because you had to run the whole county.
That's right. And I started out at Bell, Great Falls, and then Cascade. But as I ran and met people door to door, the more I was exposed, the more I realized I don't think this party is the party I should be in. So when we voted in November, I voted for myself, 2 other Republicans, the rest Democrats, and God didn't strike me dead. You know, so
you didn't get that.
no. But you know, I think
That had to be disconcerting not to be there, because it was so much fun in 1971.
well,
wasn't it?
but in 70, when I didn't win, and the legislature was such a mess, I took out an ad in the Great Falls Tribune, and I said, "Attention, Cascade County voters, thank you for not electing me to this session of the legislature." But so you
And
know,
then one of the businesses put the story on their
yeah,
cash register for the
Howard's-
public to see.
Howard's Pizza in Great Falls.
But the point being, 71 was a very difficult session, and it was split between the Democrats controlling the Senate and the House being controlled by the Republicans, with the big Donnybrook over the sales tax. But then, in 1973-74 session, remember that was the time we had the 2 years together, the Democrats ended up in charge fairly strongly over both houses. And then in the 75 session, a gigantic Democratic lead, which was a product of not only the Constitution and the sales tax, but Watergate, had set the tone then. And then in the 77 session, they were tied in the Senate, but still maintained a big lead of Democrats in the House. And so at that time, it eventually, by the way, in 79, the Senate flipped Republican, and a lot of the accomplishment period was over. So, but in those 3 or 4 sessions there seemed to be the time when all this stuff the real advancements took place, and it was a product of that sales tax and Watergate, and all of a sudden progressives were more in charge.
Well, I can only speak for the teachers, but in 1973, and I think it was Senator Bill Birchie from Cascade County, introduced and got passed a meet and confer law for teachers for bargaining. Now that had come about, and so many people don't realize that today, that teachers, well, like in Great Falls, they had a salary committee who went to the administration building, met with the superintendent, who carried their concerns to the board. The board came back and told the superintendent what, and then he came back and informed the teachers. Now, we knew as teachers there was a salary committee, but they could not tell us what was going on except that they were meeting, and maybe it was hopeful, maybe it wasn't hopeful. And then we didn't know until it had been agreed to and given to us to vote. Now, this is even more pathetic than people think. I can remember sitting in the auditorium of Paris Gibson Junior High School then, when it came time to ratify what had been agreed on. And the elementary principals and their teachers all sat together by school. When it came time to vote, those teachers would look at the principal. The principal would either go yes or no. And that's how bad it was for teachers. Well,
almost a copper collar in
legislation,
because that's what used to happen with the Anaconda Company. Oh, yeah. They'd set up to do like this.
Yeah. And so the frustration then started building, and that led to the 73
to Birchie's bill.
Well, in 2 years.
Now, by the way, during 73, Birchie also did the other bill.
Yeah,
right?
1973 saw the passage of collective bargaining for
public
employees.
Right.
And the teachers were left out of that.
Yep,
and
yep. Let me get to that. I'll handle that part.
But you guys, Birchie was also the sponsor of the collective bargaining bill.
Yes.
In 73.
In 73.
Right.
And he was a senator from Great Falls.
Right.
Yes. And Dwayne Johnson.
Now, hold on that, because so what happened from 73 to 75 with teachers was the meet and confer ended up being meet and defer. No, nothing was settled. And so the frustration built so that in 1975, the MEA had a proposal for collective bargaining. Well, the Great Falls Education Association looked at it and didn't think it was enough. So we bolted, and we met with the president of the MEA and the executive director, saying that we could not go along with it, so asked for another board meeting and have it changed up. They didn't. So the MEA, so the GFEA was the sore thumb in the association, but we stood by what eventually became the public employees bargaining law, including teachers.
It included teachers in 75. And was that the one that Dwayne
Johnson
and
Pete Gilligan.
And Pete Gilligan.
Pete Gilligan from Great Falls. Pete Jr.
Pete Gilligan. Pete Jr.'s dad served in the legislature. No, earlier. Earlier, and his dad was a business agent for the Plumbers and Fitters Union up in
Great Falls.
So we had, and Dwayne Johnson was an officer with the paper workers union in Missoula.
So Birchie's bill in 73 opened the door for collective bargaining for all public employees except teachers who were left with meet and defer or confer. And then in 75, in terms of collective bargaining, they were folded in
Right.
by the Johnson-Gilligan bill into
That was revolutionary because
Oh, sure was.
for the first time, teachers could bargain not only their salaries but their fringe benefits. They bargained also that, for example, that vacancies had to be posted. The whole that all it just was wide open. And
But the other thing that teachers benefited by with that was they gained the right to strike,
Right.
which they didn't have before. But let me go back to just talk about meet and confer for just a minute, because that's exactly what public employees had prior to the Birchie bill passing that gave
Same thing,
collective bargaining rights for public employees. And there was I remember we used to talk about collective bargaining rights because what it was meet and confer, and the reason that we even had meet and confer for public employees was because of a Teamsters case that went to the Montana Supreme Court, and in effect what they did is approved this meet and confer kind of a structure. But what meet and confer was, as John has just explained that very well, it's not collective bargaining. It's really collective begging, because there's no obligation there's no obligation for the employer to agree to anything. All they have to do is just simply meet and confer.
And of course, the most important pressure point a worker can do is the withholding of his labor, which is the value that the entity, whether it's a business or a school or whatever, their value they get is out of the work of the employee. And if they can't withhold that work, they essentially lose their most important leveraging tool.
That's right. That's right.
But once that was passed, it still caused a lot of agony among many teachers, because they had been treated. They'd been told that they were professional people. Well, they weren't professional. Any profession has right over their working conditions and setting the standards in that. And still teaching today has not reached that point where they are a profession, because they do not have any control over, they don't have their own, what am I trying to say, board to set the certification standards for teachers, training and that. So, and it was interesting to me, because at that time, one thing teachers were saying is they didn't want to be a union. And when I came back to Montana after serving in Connecticut, a few years later was asked to speak at some forum, and then teachers were calling themselves a union. And
The world changed while you went to Connecticut.
That's right.
Jeez.
That's right.
So we're sending you back now. We want some
okay.
changes now. We're going to send you back to Connecticut, and we'll get some changes. But when you look at 75 as being an extraordinary session, because part of it had to do with the size of the majorities, but in terms of labor lost, when you look at the collective bargaining, I noted that one of the things that passed, and it was pretty important, was just banning the importation of strikebreakers.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
I mean, often that was a tactic, wasn't it?
Oh,
that
yeah.
had to be dealt with.
Yes. We dealt with that not only in the public sector, but in the private sector as well.
But there also, in the 75 session, it allowed public employees to become members of the they could run for the legislature. Bill Spar,
a leave of absence for running.
Bill Spar in Great Falls before 75 was elected to the House, I think 2 or 3 times, and he was somewhat challenged,
financially,
almost a court case, but it never went that far, to prohibit him from serving because he was a teacher. And then we had good people like Pat Ryan from Billings and that. So
Pat Regan.
Pat Regan.
Pat Regan.
Well, there are a lot of good teachers, but frankly, maybe the door was opened a lot by that thing that said every business, whether you're in the public sector entity or your private business, if somebody runs for the legislature and wins, that's your employee, you are obligated to give them up to 180 days of annual leave to be able to do it.
And that's what that was. That's what.
And that opened the doors for a different class of people to be able to run for the legislature.
That's exactly right. But public employees were really treated, not only teachers, but public employees were treated as second-class citizens prior to this period. During that session, that we got unemployment compensation benefits for public employees, and that was a big deal. I mean,
Think about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, not all public employees were able to get unemployment coverage if they lost their job.
But also for women, they got maternity leave.
Maternity leave.
That's right.
And
Gee, sounds like we were doing a lot of good stuff.
well,
in the mid-70s.
in my opinion, in the years I've lived in Montana, that's been since 1959, with the exception of 12 years in Connecticut. The only legislature that has really worked for the welfare of the average citizen in this state to improve their condition in life was the 1975 legislature. It hasn't been matched since, and I'm hoping one of these days it'll be surpassed.
Yeah, well, it's the list of accomplishments is rather extraordinary. Now let's jump quickly into a field that major improvement occurred during this period, and that's in workers' compensation.
Yes, yes.
Where did we start out with when
Well,
this period?
I came to Helena, Arlene and I came to Helena in 1966 to work in that political campaign when Lee Metcalf was challenged by Tim Babcock. At that time, we had some of the less generous laws in the nation for things like workers' comp and unemployment comp. There would only be maybe one state in the nation that would have poorer benefits than did Montana. And all of a sudden, during this period of time that we're discussing right here, we went to the top in the nation. Would be top two or three states in the nation for benefits. An example, a big thing with unemployment comp, there was a point there that when people were on strike, they were entitled to unemployment compensation benefits. That was later changed because the legislature felt that that was just too liberal. We fought to make that change, by the way, and tried to keep it, and we were unable to do that. But there was dramatic changes. But in addition to that, we had a workers' comp system that was really corrupt. There was lawyers, doctors were involved in
it was kind of a nest feathering system. If you were a certain kind of lawyer, a certain kind of doctor, or something, you got the special privileges and lots of money, but it didn't always benefit the worker.
That's right. The attorneys got the cases. They carried the cases, made the argument before the Workers' Comp Commission, and then it was always the same doctors that were used for the examinations to determine the degree of disability. And so as we saw that, we said, geez, there's a hell of a lot of people here that are benefiting by this system that was put in place to benefit workers. And it got so it wasn't about workers, it was about all of these people on the periphery that were taking advantage of workers.
And I think that there was a workers' compensation, what I think Governor Judge had it called a Labor and Management Advisory Board.
Workers' Compensation Advisory Committee.
And in the I believe it was the 1970, Workers' Comp, in the 1973 session,
1973.
they advanced 25 bills to reform it, and 24 of them passed.
Really, those were some major changes. Interesting thing about that is that because of the influence of the labor movement, there were people that were on the business side of the whole workers' comp program, and they were really concerned about what we were going to do with making changes in the legislature. So there was an effort, a tremendous effort, to cooperate and make what we all recognize together on these advisory committees, recognize together that really should be changed fairly for workers. And those were.
And then in '75, you went after the system again to make it even better, because I think some more revelations had come about, and isn't that when the big reform came in terms of setting it up with the judge?
That's right. I think it was Pat McKittrick that carried that legislation from Great Falls, that set up the independent workers' comp judge system that is still
in place today.
Still in place today.
And it used to be that it was pretty much an in-house deal. And then of course our great friend, wonderful Bill Hunt, was appointed to be the first.
He was the
judge,
first workers' comp judge.
Later served 16 years on the Supreme Court, and he was terrific. He just passed away recently, and we lost him. But he got that thing started. But that was a revision of the whole system in '75, and then in '75, on top of all those changes, I believe a bunch of changes took place, like controlling the fees for attorneys, and actually making sure that clients knew they got a settlement.
Yeah, that's
wasn't there some kind of a problem?
Well, during that period of the so-called scandal, there were examples of where workers got benefits, but they were never told about it.
By their attorneys.
By their attorneys. and the money ended up going to the attorneys, and the attorneys just kept the money. Or would give, they maybe
spread it
give,
around.
Maybe they'd give the injured worker something, but not nearly what he was entitled to. So we changed the law so that by law, those settlements went to the.
We now call that transparency.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a good word for it. Huh?
But one of the things about the workers' comp system that we should, I think it's important to remember for historical purposes, as we look at that system today, we think of it in terms of being a worker benefit. Isn't that the tendency?
It's supposed to be.
Well, and it wasn't set up to benefit workers. The workers' comp systems were set up in the nation to limit the liability that employers had because of what was happening in the court system, and frankly, we'd have been better off if we'd have just been able to sue instead of having a workers' comp, or having these workers' comp laws that were passed in all the states of the nation.
In fact, one of the things in '75 that happened was they removed a restriction that if you had a permanent disability, you could only get benefits for it for 36 months.
That's right. That's right.
So that was removed in
that was removed,
1975.
and that was changed. But I remember one time in a hearing, it was a really contentious hearing about workers' comp, and God, they were just there were some of the conservatives there that were just beating the hell out of me, and so I said, well, look, if you're having all these problems with workers' comp, why don't you just repeal the law, and you can, lay off all those people that work at workers' comp, and we just get rid of the law. And there was one of the Republican members of the committee said, "Would you be willing to do that?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I think we would." And some of the attorneys, Republican attorneys, were saying to this legislator said, "Don't listen to him. Don't listen. Don't listen to him."
The system was serving the interest.
And so what we had is we had a system that was put in place to limit the liability for employers. Anaconda Company was responsible for the workers' comp system.
In fact, we recall that this wonderful story from the 1955 legislature about Leroy Anderson talking about trying to change the silicosis benefits for widows or those or spouses that remained, and it turned out the silicosis benefits were written as being the responsibility not of the insurance company where it affected your premiums. It wasn't part of your insurance. It was outside the insurance, and it was the responsibility of the state and the welfare offices in the counties. So the public bore the brunt of all the silicosis problems that occurred in Montana instead of the Anaconda Company. So there was a lot of interesting things.
And it was primarily the Anaconda Company the problem because of the silicosis and the company.
And Little Black Lung, same thing in the coal industry. Yeah.
But the companies made the argument that the problems that miners were having was because they all were heavy smokers. It wasn't their it wasn't related to their employment.
Yeah.
And we had tough hearings, really tough hearings over
Now,
that.
one of the things that happened in '75 too was that was of some import was the benefits under workers' comp had suffered from the same problem that that minimum wage suffered from, which was it was a fixed rate on some things, and so they ended up saying that the benefit became a percentage of the average weekly wage in the state, and as the average weekly wage went up,
there was an increase.
There was an increase in those benefits. It didn't have to keep going back to the legislature and trying to get it improved. So I think there were a lot of real big improvements in workers' comp.
And then of course what finally happened is there was kind of a stagnation, so that the average wage wasn't going up as rapidly as it was when Montana was so highly unionized. Mm-hmm. So that impacted workers' comp benefits in a way that we didn't foresee at that time.
Yeah,
we just didn't anticipate that being the case. But
and I think another thing in '75 that was interesting was some companies didn't insure themselves. And so the legislature that you guys all worked on set up a fund for uninsured companies, employers. Kind of like it's kind of like that same thing with insurance. You know, what about your car insurance? What about that guy that doesn't have insurance? And you can buy something to protect yourself.
That's
so
right.
that kind of happened too. So an awful lot of things happened in that, and we talked about unemployment comp quite a bit, and I think that it looked like the minimum weekly dollars that were allowed were raised, and
raised significantly. We were at the bottom nationally, and we were raised in to the top states in the nation. The labor movement has really suffered in the last few years with all of those benefits, and not only here in Montana, but all across the nation.
One of the things that was going on that affected workers was when they were unemployed and they were sometimes in a situation where they went to a private company to help them get a job, and the private companies took exorbitant fees, like 60% of their first 3 months' wages and things like that.
That's right.
Didn't you guys get that regulated?
Yes,
somewhat?
we did. And the other thing that happened, we had that kind of a situation, and then the other thing that happened over the years is that workers were forced to become so-called independent contractors. So they were responsible for paying their own workers' comp premiums, unemployment comp premiums, and all that. Because they were independent contractors. They took instead of being a worker, in the sense that Montana workers had always been workers, they became an employer of sorts, because in many instances they would bring people on with them to do a job, and they had the responsibility of providing, again, workers' comp and unemployment comp coverage, and that is a problem today.
Hasn't that still remained since the solution to that, I believe, was administrative and how you administered the laws?
That's right.
That if you had the wrong administration that didn't care about it, then it wouldn't be strongly enforced. And then everyone would be trying to push workers off into contracts. And then if you have an administration that wants to enforce it strongly, their employees in the Labor Department will work real hard. I think there have been a lot of rules and regulations adopted since then to help with that.
Oh yeah, and friendly administrations are really important in all of that. On things like wage collection, there's a division within the Department of Labor that compliance officers are constantly auditing employers around the state to see if they're paying, for example, meeting the prevailing wage laws. And that's a major function with the Department of Labor. Mm-hmm. So if you have an administration that is very friendly to employers, you don't have you
Not a lot of
you don't have that
enforcement, yeah.
enthusiasm
Yeah.
to make sure that they comply with the law.
Now, on that wage protection is something that was a lot of activity that went on during the 70s. Little Davis Bacon was threatened a lot.
Prevailing wage.
I should say Little Davis Bacon. That's a state prevailing wage rate,
That's right.
which says if you're built in public contracts, you have to pay the prevailing wage rate. You can't bid these contracts out and lowball it and pay people poverty wages to do public work. And that was always under assault too. But you guys beat back a lot of stuff on that, didn't you? Wasn't there a lot of defensive stuff here too?
And Evan, that's another law that we really need to remember the history of why prevailing wage laws came about. Prevailing wage laws came about to protect good employers.
Right.
That's why the
employers weren't undercut by
that's
lowball
right, that's
employers.
right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that today, with the decline in union membership, in the old days we had about 50% of the workforce in Montana in unions. We're down to in the private sector to 6% today.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty significant drop.
I remember a few years ago having a conversation with a representative of one of the contractors associations at a conference, and I was a strong advocate as a speaker at that conference, talking about the need to have increased unionization, because you could draw a parallel between union households and the viability of the economics of the middle class, the buying power of the middle class. And the decline of union households also meant the decline of the buying power of the middle class, and that you needed to have good union wages, and you needed to consider the prevailing wage rate issue, and that when these lowball contractors were coming in, they were really, hurting the Montana contractors.
That's right, and good contractors.
Yeah, good contractors. But it's funny how politics is. Sometimes it's hard for those guys to recognize that. It seems like they think it's only to protect the workers.
Well,
when in
but
fact
see,
it's,
the reason they're responding the way that individual did with you, and I remember you talking about that, is that all of a sudden today prevailing wage laws are looked upon as a worker protection,
mm-hmm.
not an employer protection. Because we have for one thing, we have so many non-union contractors in the state, a lot of contractors coming from out of state, and there's a lot of violations of the prevailing wage law. So that workers go out. These workers are now more inclined to be non-union than not.
Mm-hmm.
When they go out, they really want to be on a prevailing wage job. The thing that drives the prevailing wage law is what? Is union contracts. That's what holds prevailing wage up at a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
But let me give you an example of how that has suffered. One of the toughest jobs in a refinery, and I worked in a refinery for 10 years, was that of being a stack painter. And I can remember negotiating contracts. The stack painters were the highest paid classification in our contract, because they were working up there 150 feet in the air on a bosun chair, sitting in a bosun chair, spraying lead-based paint that is just an absolute killer. And that was the highest paid job in a refinery. We couldn't get guys. It was so dangerous. We couldn't get guys to bid the job, so they contracted that work out. I have a friend in the Department of Labor that had a case up in Great Falls at a refinery up there, where stack painters came in from out of state, came from Minnesota. The prevailing wage for stack painters was $13 an hour. That should be, and it shouldn't be less than $65, $70. $13 an hour.
By the way, speaking of that and talking a little bit about the worker safety part, there was a few things happened on worker safety that were interesting. One of them had to do with passing a bill to prohibit asbestos spray material in construction. That was one of the things that happened to that great 1975 legislature, was they said, hey, you can't be making workers spray asbestos. Now that was kind of ahead of its time because clearly we've learned what a disaster asbestos has been, particularly in Libby, but what it was. And that was a bill that came through the 75 session. But I believe another thing that in the middle of all that stuff, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Act, had been federally passed. And there were people that wanted to strip away the federal involvement and put it in the hands of the state, which probably would have watered down the enforcement, wouldn't it?
Well, that was certainly our position, and some of the states adopted state enforcement for OSHA. We took the position that it didn't make any difference what administration it was. Workers were really victimized out on jobs because employers had so much influence on the job, and so we insisted on enforcement, on federal enforcement, and it was a major battle. That was the beginning of what ended up in that workers' comp scandal that we talked about for just a little bit before. But yeah, we had and I can remember when we were testifying against state enforcement. We had a lot of examples of where there'd been some of the faulty equipment had been red tagged out on jobs, and instead of shutting the equipment down, employers would take the red tags off.
And that made them safe.
And workers, and as a result of that, workers were crippled and killed and maimed, and we said no, we're not going to go for this.
That's a little bit similar to the idea that you can take federal lands and put them under state control, and somehow it'll be better.
Yeah.
That's a today issue, by the way.
That is right.
And a questionable one. But when you start looking at all this stuff, it appears as if, and would you comment briefly on this, and then we'll kind of start moving toward a close, but that it appears like things did peak in 1975. And there were still some advances in 77, but a little in 71, a decent amount in 73, a lot in 75, and then it looked like it started to become a defensive game of trying to stop the erosion of these things. Does that kind of ring true that you were spending a lot of time defensively in the late 70s?
We were still making. We still had some good legislative sessions, and we maintained a pretty high level of benefits under the worker protection laws, minimum wage. All of those laws were still some of the best. But as the political tone changed in the state and changed nationally, the labor movement all over the country has been put in a defensive kind of a position. In those sessions of the legislature, my recollection is that we used to we'd testify on 100 to 120 bills during the legislature with prepared testimony, and our testimony was usually put together with a fact sheet that supporters could use that information to help make the arguments for our position on the floors and in the committees too of the legislature. Now
I want to comment on one thing, and then I'm going to ask you guys to give me some of your closing thoughts. But things have come a long ways from, as you said, when you came back from Connecticut, people thought in the MEA thought they were in a union, and it's to the point that the two teachers unions, the MFT, Montana Federation of Teachers, which was an AFL-CIO union, and the MEA, which was considered an association in the old days, first in the nation, I think, to have merged, or one of the first to have merged. And so that clearly the teachers are a public employee union now without question, aren't they?
Yes.
I wondered if you might take a minute or two and give some reflection on the changes that took place in the 70s from your perspective in terms of the advancement of teachers in public education, I mean public collective bargaining and so on. We only have a couple of minutes, but if you wouldn't mind.
Well, it won't take me that long. I think what has been achieved is that they have teachers now, because of collective bargaining and the laws there, have the power or have the authority to really make some demands for the improvement of the profession as well as public education. But what I see now, and I am not involved, so I can't speak from an internal thing, what I see now happening not only with labor and these other organizations, it's now a fight to maintain what has been gained. And with the threat of the right to work coming, I mean, a lot of energy is going for that, fighting it. And so I think it's a maintenance thing. It's not really, as we would have termed it back when I was president, an advocacy organization where we're out advocating for the improvement of this, that. I'm not saying that some of that isn't happening, but I think the major energy now is to maintain and not lose what has been gained.
Well, if you have an arc of progress that's based on progressivity, it means that when you get something, you can't have a retrenchment. If you get a retrenchment, you know, you try to stop that from happening, and it's always a constant battle.
Well, that's right. Jeanette Rankin told me once, when she was near 90, that one of the hardest things about growing old was having to fight some of the same battles over and over again.
Wow.
Oh, that is,
And I think
really,
that's where we are today. We're fighting some of the same
point.
battles over again.
That's very insightful, isn't it? Yeah.
And what is disappointing to me is that we have some teachers in Montana today being hired who really meet the poverty level. You can't raise a family of 4 on $20,000 a year and do it well. And so I think, well, that's just
constant struggle. Jim, your kind of thoughts on the 70s as far as the advancements of, and then and we know we're on the defensive to retain those, but about the 70s as an advancing thing for labor.
Well, I guess one of my observations of that whole time was going back to my opening remarks about how Montana has always been one of the most, for years and years, long before I showed up, Montana was one of the most highly unionized states in America. That was our culture. And so with that, we had, you know, we had more members, especially in the private sector. And during those years, we had a reputation of we would be involved in the political campaigns. We made endorsements of people running for public office, and by virtue of polls taken by the National AFL-CIO, we had workers were inclined to follow those COPE endorsements as well as any state in America. So we had these vast numbers, but we had a very effective political effort that elected people to public office, that we were able to be in a position of advocacy, John, and not be just defending what we had.
Part of it wasn't just
changed.
about the political climate, it was about the strength of
That's right.
workers and labor
And we
as
were
part
able
of
to
it.
say, yeah, and we were able to contribute to that political tone that was pro-worker.
Well, time's running out on us. It's amazing how fast an hour goes, and we're dealing with such an exciting and interesting subject and an important subject. And I want to say thanks to both of you. You're champions of workers, both of you in your own rights, and it's a privilege to have you on this program. What happens with workers in a state is all about the social fabric and the economic fabric of the state, and that's what makes a state unique and makes Montana a special place, is how we treat our people. And that's the job which you guys have been aspiring to for so many years, and you played such a big role. So thanks for joining us. And for all of you who are watching, we look forward to seeing you on the next edition of In the Crucible of Change.